Good evening, persons of quality, and here is your Percy Shelley lecture. So just hang on one quick second. All right, perhaps that was just a little bit bright. Okay, so I'm going to start with some biographical information of Percy Shelley, as you saw on that initial title slide at the beginning of the presentation. So, Percy Shelley, Percy Bysshe Shelley, B-Y-S-S-H-E. That is his middle name. So we have covered William Blake, Wordsworth, and Coleridge so far. We also introduced our first of the revolutionary poets in Lord Byron, and we covered She Walks in Beauty Like the Night plus Darkness. So at least those two should have some detailed notes and annotations in your material. So I think that's very important. Now, also as far as the research paper goes, you should have done a decent job on your first body paragraph based upon your research and based upon the ideas that you've developed already. So if you have done that, you should be in good shape. Of course, for 2024, the draft of that will be uploaded to Mudge by Wednesday evening. So I think that's going to be important. So, okay, you'll see me looking down. I tried before of holding the notes up like this, but it would block my microphone, and you guys did some complaining, and I didn't want that to happen. No, not really. It's just that it's too hard to look at it that way. So if you look at Percy Bysshe Shelley, we know that he's an English writer, and he's famous today for being one of the major romantic poets. We also know that he was infamously married to Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein. So when we look at Percy Shelley, his poetry, both the really long, sort of almost epic kinds of things, and the short, very lyric, very memorable pieces are widely read and studied. Probably why we're looking at it as a junior at U of D Jesuit. We know he had a big influence on the literary community of his day, and he also impacted future generations of writers. So this is one of those authors that's going to spend a tremendous amount of time in our focus as we move forward. He's also famous for his friendships with John Keats, the last of our British Romantic poets, and Lord Byron, who we just covered. And if you remember, Lord Byron walks in beauty like the night, and he's quite filled with darkness, if you catch my puns there. We also know that Percy Shelley is known extraordinarily for his marriage to Mary Shelley, or Mary Godwin Wollstonecraft, who is the daughter of the woman who wrote The Vindication of the Rights of Women, and her father, William Godwin, was a natural philosopher that greatly influenced the themes that Shelley used in her novel, Frankenstein. If you look at Percy Shelley's biographical information, he's known primarily for his literary works, but he also lived a very, very interesting, although brief, life. And that's one of the reasons why he stands out as a romantic, too, is because he lived this extraordinarily short, brief life. He's particularly notable because his background and experiences are vastly different compared to the relatively tame life of the Wordsworth and Coleridges that we looked at. Shelley came from an aristocratic family, makes him vastly different than your previous romantic authors. But he really didn't benefit from the situation as much as he might have done because of a variety of factors that he made, choices he made as a young adult. So he sort of alienated his family because he's one of those guys that lived fast, died young, was an embarrassment to his family, those things. So we take a look at his early life. He's born August 4th, 1792 at Field Place in Sussex. Now, if you notice, this is a bit more in-depth than I gave you with the other authors. It's just time to get to some of these more interesting tidbits of information. We know that for Percy Shelley, his father was a baronet, Baronet, which means he was titled, which is why Byron goes by Lord Byron. I'm sorry, misspoke. This is why it's important for Shelley, because it gave him access to the larger circles of famous people. Shelley's mother was Elizabeth Shelley Nee Pilford. That Nee is N-E-E with the accent over that second E. Pilford, P-I-L-F-O-R-D. This is the opportunity for you to gain some bonus by paying attention to these details. He was the oldest of 6 children. All the kids lived to adulthood. Big deal for that time period, as many of our authors were steeped in tragedy because their siblings died off. The names of those siblings isn't necessarily important for us now. We do know that his middle name, Bysshe, B-Y-S-S-H-E, came from his grandfather, who was Sir Bysshe Shelley, and he was a baron. Again, there is some significant connections that those names got him. What I find very interesting, though, however, is that despite all of this, Percy Shelley was a poet and a political radical. So that idea that he's a political radical here at 6 minutes and 42 seconds is important because it focuses on what Shelley does to criticize the norm in his poetry. Again, pay attention to how he criticizes the norm in his poetry. We know that at an early age, he started school at Syon House Academy, S-Y-O-N, located near London. He was severely bullied during his time at school. And just, again, find it interesting. He's such a dynamic personality, but he's bullied. And 2 years later, he left and enrolled at Eton College. So first of all, he was at Syon Academy, S-Y-O-N, and he left there to enroll in Eton College. But it was during this time that Shelley developed his interest in writing both poetry and prose. So when he went to Eton College is when the literary career really takes off. In 1810, at the end of his tenure at Eton College, is when he really starts to produce his major works. So we do want to attend to the impact of those ideas and how they influenced his material. On another note, Percy Shelley had a very important friendship with Lord Byron. Of course, how these two were connected, it makes some sense. So if I look at that, when he and his family traveled to Switzerland, they stayed with Lord Byron until a lack of money forced them to return to England. They visited Byron again a year later because Claire Claremont was in love with him. It's an interesting name because if you read things like Frankenstein, these are the characters, the Harriet, the Claire Claremont. These are some of the names that Mary Shelley used in formulating the characters in that particular work. So they visited Byron in Switzerland a while later. And because of this, Claire Claremont and Shelley had a daughter. But their relationship didn't last. And this is kind of what was going on with Percy Shelley. Largely known as a womanizer, just kind of like Byron was. And Percy Shelley was rather unstable. So he went through these marriages rather quickly. And they have sort of a lasting impact on his development as an author. If we look at these sort of things that happened during one summer in Geneva, Byron and the Shelleys got into the habit of telling each other ghost stories. And these stories eventually were what formed the basis for Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. While this is about Percy Shelley, I just find this to be an interesting sort of little triangle, if you will, or triangulation of these characters or authors. While in Southern Europe, 1818 until Percy Shelley's death in 1822, he didn't live in England. He and Mary Shelley traveled throughout Southern Europe, living primarily in Italy and also spending time with Byron and other poets, writers, and political radicals. Now, this is what's important. During this period of time, Shelley published most of his famous works, including Prometheus Unbound. Very famous poem. Remember, Prometheus is the Titan, sort of, that stole fire from the Olympian gods. And so as a result, he was chained to a rock. An eagle came every day and ate his liver. So he suffered extraordinarily. But he brings fire to the humans. So he gives human beings knowledge, and he's forever tortured as a result of those consequences. He also produced a few other works. They're not going to be relevant to you because you won't study them in high school. But again, I think this is kind of an interesting set of ideas. Shelley suffered some mental and physical health problems near the end of his life while in Italy, as did Mary Shelley. Their last years together were marked by tragedy as several of their children died. These romantics are going to be marked by tragedy overall. It's one of those crazy kinds of things that happens. So again, probably worth a little bit of time thinking about and looking at his historical development. If I look at a few last major elements, is one of Shelley's significant poems was the one titled Ozymandias, which is what the second part of this lecture is going to be about. He wrote Ozymandias as a challenge between him and his friend Horace Smith, another author. Shelley was a prolific, writing several epic poems and shorter works in addition to political sort of commentary and things like that that explained his radical beliefs about free love. Now, perfectly interesting idea as it connects to Mary Shelley, but when we talk about this element of free love, it only lasted until both he and Mary Shelley sort of had this come to Jesus moment where they decided to get married and settle down, even though they were both rather opposed to those traditional ideas of marriage. Percy Shelley was in a boat in the middle of, I believe it was Lake Geneva, and mysteriously fell off and drowned. So it was sort of a tragic death, untimely. Who knows exactly what caused him to fall out of the boat in the middle of the night and drown. But again, something worth at least our paying attention to. So I've given you quite a bit of biographical information from my notes, about 3 pages. So when you take a look at these details at roughly 13 and a half minutes, you want to make sure you've got some particular background for Percy Shelley. I'm now going to transition over into his poem. Okay, so the first chunk of this video, roughly 13 minutes, was all about Shelley and his specific background and sort of why he was influenced. And at the end of that first segment, I hinted at Ozymandias, which is a significant and memorable poem by Percy Shelley. As I was going through and sort of identifying my notes for Ozymandias, I found my notes on Ode to the West Wind. So that should be another set of content that I'll make available to you this week. I just need to find it, and if I can't find it, I'll just remake it. So Ozymandias is another name for, I believe, Ramses II, which was a great Egyptian pharaoh. So I think that's important. Also, which references back to what we did with William Shakespeare, Francesco Petrarch, is the idea that Ozymandias is only 14 lines long. So it's one of Shelley's rather brief poems, but being that it's a sonnet and its structure, I think, is extraordinarily significant to us. So we know that Ozymandias is a famous poem. It is one of Shelley's most famous poems, and it is a particularly popular because it is short and it doesn't take all of that stretching out and looking at metaphors and trying to do a lot of that specific work that Shelley's poetry has sort of driven us to be able to do. So we know that it is a sonnet, 14 lines, and in this particular poem, Shelley explores several major themes of romantic poetry, which takes you back to those specific characteristics that we keep covering over and over again, including the impermanence of empire and the sublime. Let's back that up for a second. So one of the major themes of this poem is the impermanence of life, or more specifically, the impermanence of rulership or reign. So every king's reign comes to an end, and then you lose that empire, or that new idea has to move forward. The poem was originally published in a magazine called The Examiner in 1818, the same year that Mary Shelley published her transformative novel Frankenstein. We also know that Percy Shelley was 25 years old when he published that poem, and I think that's going to be extraordinarily important. One of those extraordinarily young but extraordinarily brilliant poets seems to be a characteristic of these revolutionary romantic poets. Live fast, die young, but they're extraordinarily brilliant. So if I leave the actual reading of the poem aside, we can take a look at some of the details. So Ozymandias' brief poem, but that's okay. If you look at the poem itself, the speaker of the poem speaks to a traveler, an audience, if you will. And that traveler tells a story, very similar to what the mariner does to his wedding guest, where the speaker meets a traveler and then the traveler tells the story. And the speaker himself is not the traveler, but the one that sits and sort of gleans the wisdom of the work. And the poet, or the poet slash traveler, just begins by describing the legs of Ozymandias, the two trunks of stone that are just surrounded by endless seas of sand. And it leaves you with that impression that what has happened to what man has built. And I think that's an important premise for this. We know in a later portion of the poem, the statue's face is half buried, where it talks about the half-buried visage of cold sneer, etc., etc. So it gives me a certain feeling. So it's half buried in the sand, and it has a stern look on its face. Now that stern look is supposed to denote power, and it's supposed to denote the impact of that fierce and ferocious king. But I want you to notice something very particular. It's the theme that we have sort of addressed since December, and that's the idea of time. Time continues. So even though this statue represents a great culture, the statue represents a great many things, time has passed, and the statue is broken and crumbled in the sand. However many centuries it took for that to occur, that great empire has fallen. On the pedestal of that statue is an inscription identifying the subject as Ozymandias, which is another name for Ramses II. And it reminds us that there once was a vast city around the statue, but like everything else, it's fallen into dust, and there is only the desert that remains. time passes, all these things that man creates fades away. So while that's sort of a short summation of the poem itself, the idea that I am Ozymandias, king of kings, look at my cold sneer and be afraid, paraphrasing the last part. But again, let's take a moment here at the 6-minute and 32-second mark of this segment. Ozymandias has had extensive analysis. Percy Shelley is one of those poets that stands extraordinarily reviewed and scrutinized and all of that. The poem Ozymandias has a number of important themes and images that can be picked apart to understand better. The structure of the poem is also important to examine before looking more closely at imagery and theme. Shelley used specific poetic forms for the poem Ozymandias, meaning that the poem can be understood as part of a broader literary tradition. That's kind of, I'm throwing that out there, and I'm going to see what you come up with as an idea. We know Ozymandias is a sonnet, and true to the constraints of the sonnet form, it has 14 lines and is written in iambic pentameter. The rhyme scheme of the poem is A-B-A-B, C-D-C, E-D-E-F-E-F. Now, I'll do that again just in case you missed it the first time. A-B-A-B-A, C-D-C, E-D-E-F-E-F. Okay, so that's going to give that rhythmic pattern to it. So it gives the entire poem an interlocking feel. So you have lines that interlock with each other, very similar to what Francesco Petrarch did in his sonnets way back in January when we started this. So very similar to the work of Petrarch. Shelley enforces this interlocking idea by using enjambment or running one line into the next piece so that we make sure we understand how those ideas fit together. That should make some sense. I'm just pilfering through my notes, making sure I'm not missing anything in my analysis of Ozymandias. But I think that context and meaning is incredibly important. I'm just making sure, bear with me 1 second. I got my themes, I got my major stuff here, just making sure, pausing really quickly, just to be sure I have everything. I think my notes didn't copy as clearly as I would have liked, but alas, we'll be okay. So that's your background. Now, take a little bit of a look at the analysis. Another major image in the poem is that of the shattered visage of the poem. This is the visage, very similar to a P90X video. Look at this. This is what's amazing. See, that's right why I'm in the middle of my crosshairs. So if we look at the shattered visage, and that word shattered for me is in quotation marks, the reason we use this particular word, visage, in this context means that although the face is looking with intent at the traveler rather than lying inert. So let me rephrase that. So this broken face of the statue is staring at the speaker of the poem, thus making an impression. And by making that impression, it's what the author, the speaker, is left with. It may even seem as if the face is looking at the traveler and imparting some sort of message. Ozymandias, the broken statue's face, still has a frown and wrinkled lip, and, like I said earlier, a sneer of cold command that gives readers a sense of what he might have been like during his lifetime. So, Just the impression left by the shattered statue that time has reclaimed makes an impression upon he or she who sees it, and that's the important part of the poem. It also gives the sense that on some level we have to feel saddened about the destruction of the work. But again, that's an interesting idea. I think also incredibly interesting is the poem points out that these attributes of the face were actually created by a sculptor. It isn't just this evil, angry thing that exists, but it was created by the artistic vision of somebody else. So, sort of blending art with the impact that art has on us. Ozymandias the king himself is long dead, but what survives of him is an artistic representation. And if you look at what we've been doing this entire year, that's exactly what we're doing. We are remembering art or remembering history through the art. If you look at the inscription on the base of the statue, it's an essential image in the poem. It spells out the idea of the poem clearly, so in case I miss the details, it clearly reminds me what it's about. Ozymandias believed that his works would last forever, but the ruin of his once great statue and city tell a different story. And this gives us a really nice opportunity to talk about time. So you're going to be watching this at least in 2024 after spending the day at the park working on sort of what this next phase of your academic career is going to be. This poem, this sneer of cold command, it's an interesting idea. What are you carrying forth as you do this? Are you symbolizing the power of nature, as we've talked about all year? Or are you like the statue of Ozymandias that is really the futility of attempting to create something permanent without recognizing that time passes inevitably? Just something to think about as you go. For a recap, Ozymandias is a sonnet by romantic writer Percy Shelley. Originally written as part of a competition with his friend Horace Smith, the poem is about a traveler who tells the speaker of the poem about a mostly destroyed statue that he found in the desert. The traveler begins by describing the statue's legs, which are the only part still standing. He goes on to describe the face, which seems almost sad, as though Ozymandias knows that his empire has fallen, or, even more importantly, that time has passed and all that power no longer exists. The poem is an exploration of the impermanence of empire. It's an interesting idea in the notes, but I think it's also sort of a record for the impermanence of all things. We spent a lot of time this year talking about how the inevitable thing, the one thing we can't control, is death. And much of our poetry is designed to capture this concept of immortality. So no matter how great Ozymandias once was, his works have largely been destroyed by time. And even more important than being destroyed by time, they are largely forgotten. So all of our contributions, no matter how great they are, ultimately get covered by sand and disappear. Shelley suggests that what really stands the test of time is art. His poem will still be read and copied long after his death because it is not subject to the ravages of nature and is much more easily preserved. Again, the poem is not subject to the ravages of nature, and it's much more easily preserved in the things that we spend our time looking at. Now, ultimately, after I produce this, I'm going to spend some time transitioning over to the Ode to the West Wind. If I have to record a new video, I'll do that. If I don't, then what I'll do is I'll just give you access to the other materials that I have presented you with as we go. I do want to leave you with 3 themes here at 16 minutes and 21 seconds of this particular segment. Theme 1, the inevitability of imperial decline. All kings rise and they fall. Transfer that to what happens to humanity. Theme 2, the power of nature, almost unstoppable in its preservation. And 3, the timelessness of art. Art for art's sake. In the back of my room, I've got Monet. To your right, if you're looking at me, I have Japanese art on the wall. And I also have mindfulness on the wall next to the windows. So certainly, these are some ideas that you can pay attention to. This is your homework. Good luck. Godspeed. See you in the morning.